Hey, Cypher here. And before we get started, I want to mention that this episode is being done in conjunction with Will from The Exploration. We wanted to talk about how representative democracy can be subverted or turned into tyranny, a pretty apt subject at any time. It is always a pressing matter. So I'm going to be looking at America, whereas he is looking at Germany.
Our goal in this collaboration isn't to induce panic or draw false parallels. Tyranny and authoritarianism come in many forms and develop differently. What we want to achieve with our two videos is not to provide absolute answers, but rather to facilitate a larger and more mature conversation about authoritarianism.
Here in the United States, we have a very clear way of defining tyranny within our government, yet somehow it's vague as well. Since our Constitution was created in 1787, usurping that Constitution has been the easiest way to proclaim someone as a tyrant. But defining what is and isn't against the Constitution is left up to one branch of government, the judiciary. Yet they kind of just granted it to themselves. There is no provision in Article 3 of the Constitution that states that the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review. Yet in 1803, they proclaimed they did. The power of judicial review is taken for granted today, but many anti-federalists called it tyranny even then. Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, even said the court's members would become despots. So even the idea of constitutionality is founded in scandal. Every branch has its fair share of tyrannical history. So let's narrow it down to the easiest to construe, the executive branch. Various presidents have committed acts of tyranny. Some were ruled against, others blinded the Supreme Court because of wartime. So let's look at a few of those specific cases over time. The first and most obvious case of presidential tyranny was during the Adams administration of 1797 to 1801. Because of the Quasi-War, an actual naval war we fought against France over a diplomatic scandal called the XYZ affair, and because of fears of the reign of terror in France spreading across the Atlantic, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, with Adams happily signing it into law. They made it a longer process to naturalize to being an American citizen, and gave the ability to deport aliens of a supposedly hostile country for whatever reason, or any alien who even vaguely scared a government official. Then even for citizens, the Sedition Act made it a criminal offense for uttering or publishing any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States. This became hilariously bad. One guy, during a parade, heard a shot fired and proclaimed, "I hope it hit Adams in the arse." He was fined for the joke. Others were not so jovial. Several people were jailed, one even dying while awaiting trial. The first person prosecuted under these laws was a congressman named Matthew Leon. Funny enough, he was re-elected to Congress while he was still in jail. How do you get re-elected from a jail cell? When he got out, he went right back to Congress to fight against these laws. The newly formed Democratic-Republican Party made it their sticking point to end these acts, so the election turned ugly.
Fight!
John Adams has a hideous hermaphroditic character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man, nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Vice President Jefferson is a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father.
Finish him!
And Adams was defeated. They repealed the sedition part, but modified the Alien Acts or let them expire. In fact, the Alien Enemies Act is still the law, despite its sordid past. But you'll see this specter of tyranny remains throughout American history. And remember, it was for a smaller war than we're waging today. Now, that wasn't challenged by the Supreme Court. In fact, the court hadn't started using judicial review yet, but this next one was quite the opposite. Andrew Jackson was never free of controversy, but the worst was the Indian Removal Act. In the original boundaries of the US, the American Indian presence had been a source of concern for the early government. Even before the Constitution, there had been continuous wars with them. The federal government had acted in good faith in trying to respect their land claims, but also sought to remove them if possible. So the Calhoun Plan was an attempt to buy Indian land, which was implemented during President Monroe's time until the 1830s, about 15 years. But Jackson pushed a different agenda. Having fought the Creeks in the War of 1812 and the First Seminole War, and being a Southerner who had what were called the 5 civilized tribes to contend with, he had a less, shall we say, civilized way of dealing with them. He wanted to move them all to a small batch of land that would come to be called Indian Territory and eventually become Oklahoma. The act that was promulgated in 1830 doesn't sound particularly troubling, with things like, "It shall be lawful for the president to cause such a tribe or nation to be protected, and to have the same superintendence and care over any tribe or nation, provided that nothing in this act contained shall be construed as authorizing or directing the violation of existing treaties." It sounds downright humanitarian. The basic idea was that they would provide money and supplies in exchange for these tribes to relocate themselves into Indian Territory. Unfortunately, that was not the real intent. Congressmen saw through the fluffy language, and many voted against it. In the House, it was decided by 101 to 97, a pretty narrow margin. The new treaties signed by these tribes to instate the relocation were not representative of most tribes as a whole, or were not ratified by their tribal organizations. Some tribes did go willingly, like the Choctaw, but most did not. The Cherokee were pretty adamant, and the Supreme Court even ruled that individual states like Georgia had no authority over them. This infuriated Jackson, who stated, "The decision of the Supreme Court has fell stillborn, and they find that they cannot coerce Georgia to yield to its mandate," which has been more popularly rendered as, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." By 1835, all the treaties had been signed, and full-on removal was taking place, often under horrendous conditions, called the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee Treaty was definitely bogus, representing a clear violation of that 1832 ruling. The tyranny here is that Jackson refused to be bound by the letter of the law specifically ruled by the Supreme Court, resulting in thousands of dead Indians. With other tribes, though, it's not so clear. For instance, the Seminoles fought a war to not be removed, but only because they broke the treaty they had fully ratified 2 years prior. So it's not as black and white if you don't focus solely on the Cherokee. Now, I could go on and on about the nuances of US-Indian relations and how presidents often resort to tyranny, but the Trail of Tears will have to suffice here. Instead, let's look at one of America's most beloved presidents, Abraham Lincoln. I've seen some folks in the comments who were hateful of Lincoln, but normally because of foolish or unspecified reasons. But his suspension of habeas corpus is one thing that can be called tyrannical. You see, the Constitution does grant the right to suspend habeas corpus, but to Congress, not the president. Lincoln suspended it to arrest a bunch of people he considered to be secessionists in Maryland after the Baltimore riot, including most of Baltimore's government and a third of Maryland's General Assembly, all without trial or even a charge. Heck, the grandson of Francis Scott Key was imprisoned in the very ramparts his grandfather wrote about in the Star-Spangled Banner. Now that's irony. The Supreme Court ruled this was unconstitutional, but Lincoln carried on with it anyways. He stopped for about 8 months after the Civil War was in full swing, but did it again to militiamen who were forming to join the Confederacy. With habeas corpus suspended, there was no means of getting these guys out of jail short of insurrection. But with a war raging, what are you gonna do? Now, I've got to say, the people saying Lincoln acted tyrannically by leaving garrisons in the South, like Portsmouth or Sumter, are very incorrect. There is absolutely nothing unconstitutional in that, nor was it Lincoln who ordered it. That was Buchanan. Lincoln simply used the positioning of those garrisons to the Union's diplomatic advantage. He did have some serious failings when it came to Indian policy, including some very real tyranny, such as his handling of various massacres that happened during the Civil War, but not when dealing with the Confederacy. So the suspension of habeas corpus may be a fairly minor thing in terms of Lincoln's presidency, but the next guy's tyranny is an overriding part of his presidency. And if you've been watching this channel, you know who's coming next. Woodrow Wilson did several things in his presidency that may easily be construed as tyrannical. His implementation of Jim Crow segregation in the federal workforce, the usurping of Congress in allowing banks to loan to the Allies, and thereby bring the US closer to joining a side in World War I, and of course his long-term wars beyond the realm of the minor interventions of previous presidents without congressional approval. But there's a much more obvious case than all of that, and it is the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act is really just a rehash of what John Adams signed into law back in the 1790s, wrought again to punish anyone who spoke out against World War I. If you spoke ill of it, then you could endanger recruitment possibilities. Funny enough, this was actually ruled on by the Supreme Court, but they actually thought it was constitutional. This is where we get the term clear and present danger, because distributing flyers that argue against the war to possible recruits was apparently not protected speech. This got further reinforced by the court, expanding it to not just World War I, but to supposed Bolshevik campaigning against the Russian intervention. In the dissenting opinion of that one, we got the whole marketplace of ideas quote. This would probably be ruled unconstitutional today, but the court was swayed by the Red Scare. In either case, the Espionage Act is still on the books, though modified to not be as bad. Many information leakers face prosecution from the act today, but normally don't end up spending much time, if any, in prison. So, to get off of Wilson, whom I'm already dedicating a couple episodes to, let's move on to the next World War. Of course, in between the wars, there was this guy who rose to power in another democracy. You might have heard of him. He's still the poster child for tyranny.
But I'll leave that one up to Will.
Be sure to go check out his channel, and come back here because the last tyrannical president on the list is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR was president longer than any other, so we can forgive him for having more than the normal amount of scandals throughout his presidency. The New Deal was pretty polarizing, but it is what he did during World War II that is clearly tyranny. After the attacks on Pearl Harbor, there was great fear of Japanese people in the States. There were known spy rings in Hawaii before the war, but somehow the fear really only applied stateside. Hawaii wasn't a state yet. The Magic Machine intercepts also indicated there was some sort of spy activity. Then there were a few incidents that cast doubt on Japanese loyalty in FDR's mind. First was the Ni Hao incident, where some local Japanese Americans helped a downed fighter pilot who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attacks. Then there were Japanese attacks on the mainland and Aleutian Islands. They took over a few islands and bombarded a few places in California and Oregon. But by the time those had happened, the War Department was already planning on what to do with any Japanese people within the United States. FDR had branded all Italians, Germans, and Japanese as enemy aliens before Germany even declared war on the US. But there wasn't as much proof of German and Italian collusion with the enemy. So FDR felt justified in taking the next step against the Japanese. Perhaps tellingly, Canada preempted him by requiring their people of Japanese descent to relocate east of the Rockies. 3 weeks later, FDR issued the infamous Executive Order 9066.
The time has come. Execute Order 66.
They began sending people of Japanese descent to internment camps, where they were excluded from possibly spying on the American war effort. These camps were only instituted stateside, and were not supposed to be like prison camps. They had full amenities, but that doesn't change the fact that they were forced out of their own homes because there were a few spies among tens of thousands.
Their evacuation did not imply individual disloyalty, but was ordered to reduce a military hazard at a time when danger of invasion was great. Americanism, taught in the schools and churches and on the playgrounds, loses much of its meaning in the confines of a relocation center.
Or in realistic terms, because FDR couldn't see them as anything other than a race. Just like last time, the Supreme Court sided with the president on this one, despite 3 cases being brought up to fight this highly discriminatory policy.
So there can be no question of the constitutionality of any part of the action taken by the government to meet the dangers of war. So no law-abiding American need to fear for his own freedom.
The court issued a coram nobis in the 1980s saying Japanese internment was unconstitutional and reparations have been paid. Interestingly enough, Aleutian Islanders were also interned during the war to protect them from possible Japanese invasion, and they too have received restitution, but only decades later. So that's where I'm going to stop. World War II is a good breaking point, but you can see a bit of a pattern here. Tyranny in America is committed by violating the Constitution, and specifically the president by imprisoning people unconstitutionally. So if you want to look at current regimes for possible tyranny, first look at who they're putting in prison. So don't forget to check out Will from the Exploration if you haven't already, because he's going to go over how tyranny in democracy can get a whole lot worse than this. But while you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.